part 6 of Deconstructing Common Life by O.G. Rose, part of the Conflict of Mind, starting with section 14. Considering the distinctions we have drawn between Hume and PD, Hume might have been disturbed by PD precisely in it being so similar to his own work, and yet in emphasizing PD identity instead of common life, PD can lead thinkers unintentionally into the very bad philosophy PD disowns and critiques. But if capitalism, globalization, the modern state, and so forth have destroyed the possibility of common life, then PD may simply be doing the best it can with the tools left at its disposal. If PD identity is not robust enough to provide what philosophy needs to become good philosophy and to fight off bad philosophy, then there might be no way that we can avoid the dire costs of bad philosophy. But is Hume's solution the correct solution to the problem of incomplete rationality? Even if PD identity is close but not enough of a solution, it wouldn't follow that Hume's common life is necessarily the solution. Perhaps the solution in Hume's day was embedded in common life, but no longer are the solution and common life merged. It should be kept in mind that virtually all common lives up to Hume's day were indivisibly married to religion, and perhaps it's not by chance that Hume therefore seemed to defend religion free of philosophical speculation as another natural belief. In fact, Hume seemed to suggest that it's impossible not to believe in God, even though he finds the theological arguments justifying God lacking. Livingston wrote that the language of common life, informing as it does a community of shared judgments, is a paradigm of non-controversial descriptive meaning, whereas philosophical language is not. As for Hume, belief in an external world is an ultimate belief which we all have and for which no evidence can be given, since the very idea of evidence presupposes it. So the truth which founds our rationality also presupposes the very idea of evidence, as does the experience and common life which orient and define our worldview. Hume admonished that the philosophical system attempts totally to replace the popular one but ironically, this and any other reflective total critique presupposes the popular system. The philosophical system has the same difficulties as the popular one. Similarly, for a rationality to critique its own truth is for the rationality to work against the groundwork of its own possibility, as is the case when philosophy deconstructs instead of refines the common life in which it is generated. But though necessary, does common life without religion entail enough weight and authority to convincingly and meaningfully address the incompleteness of rationality in practice, or is it the case that secular common life cannot carry out the necessary role determined by Hume at all, let alone partially? Perhaps without religion, common life is less capable than PD identity. Perhaps without religion, both are weaker. Similarly, for a rationality to critique its own truth is for the rationality to work against the groundwork of its own possibility, as is the case when philosophy deconstructs instead of refines the common life in which it is generated. But though necessary, does common life without religion entail enough weight and authority to convincingly and meaningfully address the incompleteness of rationality in practice? Or is it the case that secular common life cannot carry out the necessary role determined by Hume at all, let alone partially? Perhaps without religion, common life is less capable than PD identity. Perhaps without religion, both are weaker. I bring up the problem of religion because common life until recently in human history was indivisible from religion, but not anymore. When Hume defended everyday religion, he simultaneously defended an element of common life. In fact, he couldn't have one without the other. Common life is uniquely story-laden as opposed to theory-laden. But what gives those stories a commanding, assuring, and blinding power traditionally has been their appeal to a real or unreal divine order. Theoretical thinking is non-temporal, refers to universal structures, if it refers at all, and has law-like form. By contrast, historical thinking is tensed, is about individuals and has narrative form. But people have believed various narrative forms mattered because they both describe the history of a people and that people's simultaneous participation in God's providence, design, or the like. This is what has given the story of common life great authority and been an argument for why everyone should conform to it. Not every society has been religious, no, but if religion has been a source of power for common life, the loss of religion today might significantly damage the possibility of common life addressing the incompleteness of rationality well. Perhaps secular common life today is no stronger than PD identity. Hume holds at the same time that the narrative pattern is a form of understanding, and whether religious or not, common life entails a narrative that provides comprehension. The individuals and institutions of common life, which, being past referring and constituted by the narrative imagination, are usually understood only in the narrative way, and it should be noted that narratives reveal the meaning of past events by viewing them in light of the temporally later events. Thus, Lincoln's birth, which at the time of its occurrence had no special meaning, can be seen to have meaning in the light of later events, as in the narrative sentence, and so the father of Emancipation Proclamation was born. A past impression is viewed in the light of a later event which conveys significance to it, and because of that fact is called an idea. Similarly, a temporal event for the religious is viewed in light of a transcendental order, which conveys significance and is consequently considered meaningful and important. When the transcendent order is no longer ascribed to, a source of meaning is lost, and though it is still possible for the present of a common life to provide significance for its past and vice versa, the weight and power of that significance is reduced in both temporal directions. The past becomes an accidental happenstance, and the present becomes an example of another way of life, just as good or bad as any other. Everything is rendered arbitrary and accidental. Yes, there is still meaning, but who cares? I bring up this potential problem of secular common life because it might be the strongest argument for why common life no longer works like it once did for Hume, and why PD identity, which paradoxically tends to be secular, could be our only practical option, even if ideally common life would be better for addressing the problem of incomplete rationality. This line of thought is expanded on in Belonging again, but I believe it needed to be acknowledged here. Personally, I don't know if common life requires religion to be authoritative enough to ultimately ground worldviews, but it's possible rationality's necessary and best foundation no longer works. Secular common life could be enough and be practically vertical and or practically authoritative, to use language like that in The Tragedy of Us by O.G. Rose. But if only religious common life can motivate and ground average people in good philosophy, as Belonging again suggests there might be good reason to believe, then Hume's common life today might be no stronger than PD identity, and if that's the case, perhaps bad philosophy will inevitably prevail. Section 15. Hume was one of the first in modern times to appreciate the fact that the acceptability of a system is independent of the truth or falsity of its axioms. Considerations of the logical strength of the axioms to generate theorems within the system and of the system's relations, logical and otherwise, to other systems are more important than an isolated concern with the semantic properties of the axioms. A system can be internally consistent, never consist of an internal contradiction, and yet still be utterly and ultimately wrong. The consistency of a rationality relative to a truth does not prove the truth, as doesn't any evidence within a system that verifies the system's consistency. Similarly, as discussed in The Problem of Internally Consistent Systems by O.G. Rose, the non-contradiction of a philosophy does not verify either that a given common life should be replaced by it, that the common life is necessarily an expression of ultimate truth, or that the philosophical system is the best and only philosophical system. Those systems must ultimately defer to a common life. Not even the most internally consistent system can prove that a common life expresses absolute truth, and yet assuming the common life or truth doesn't negate itself, it is presupposed by any philosophical system, and is internal to the idea of empirical evidence. Hence, as described in Defining Evidence by O.G. Rose, evidence for or against a common life requires a common life to define a mere phenomenon from a phenomenon that is evidence for a case, but that means all evidence is set from the start to either maintain the common life or to deconstruct it, which would be for the evidence to turn itself back into mere phenomenon, thus negating its own possibility. Philosophy is parasitic upon the popular system, Livingston wrote. It's almost as if truth and rationality are utterly unrelated and yet utterly indivisible, and it seems Hume was one of the first, if not the first, to identify this paradoxical love-hate relationship between truth and rationality, common life and philosophy. Failure to recognize Hume's insights contribute to the slow and gradual domination of bad philosophy, autonomous rationality, and has been discussed, neoliberalism and globalization seem to be forces contributing to its mass growth as embedded in the modern state. The modern state did not create bad philosophy, but it did contribute to the decline of common life and thus contribute to the bad philosophy. Perhaps capitalism and globalization brought about the modern state, or perhaps the modern state brought about capitalism and globalization. It's hard to say. Regardless, the modern socioeconomic state has formed the environment in which bad philosophy grows, spreads, and thrives without ever fully recognizing the problem of bad philosophy. After all, that recognition would require good philosophy, and that is precisely what the modern socioeconomic state tends to reduce and forget. Coming Apart by Charles Murray is full of examples of how global capitalism is dividing everyday people from their everyday lives, whether it be due to how colleges brain drain small towns, modern capitalism forces people to move every few years for work, and or so on. Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam explores the collapse of social capital, how people no longer join civic organizations like the Lions Club, and how communities are increasingly isolated and replaced with appearances of community like modern suburbia. Global capitalism tends to replace culture with corporations, to gradually bankrupt the defining features of communities and replace them with similar stores, McDonald's, Walmart, Target, Olive Garden, effacing individuality. Robust community is replaced with general association, and increasingly, as people move between towns and cities, the differences between places shrink. Yes, there are still significant differences between Bedford and New York, but those differences are less robust. As people are forced to move out of their communities to find jobs, to attend college, and to make something of themselves, for status is increasingly centralized in the same large cities, the histories, traditions, and cultures of those communities weaken. With less people staying in the same place and putting down roots, less roots are growing, which results in people suffering more existential anxiety, precisely thanks to their efforts to make something of themselves and increase opportunity. At the same time, those who stay in the local communities and watch the communities fall apart, those who are aware that society likely thinks of them as not making something of themselves, might be increasingly likely to fall into the temptation of the banality of evil. As discussed in Belonging Again, as Given's collapse and existential anxiety increases, so too increases the appeal of totalitarianism and the likelihood that the negative dimensions of Given's manifest and intensify. Similarly, as common life dissolves, so may increase the likelihood that members of a common life turn desperate and participate in the banality of evil, ironically providing evidence that it is good and right for common life to dissolve and be replaced by PD identity, global capitalism, and so forth. That it is moral for Hume's solution to the problem of rationality to be erased. Appeals to race, sexuality, and gender are like appeals to common life, perhaps made because people understand that rationality is ultimately incomplete and must appeal to something outside itself. But can PD identity fight and stop the bad philosophy which neoliberalism incubates and spreads? We've already discussed that PD identity seems to be a paradoxical supporter of the very neoliberalism it often critiques, in that it seems to help deconstruct the common life which stands in neoliberalism's way. But we've also noted that PD identity might be all we have left in our globalized world to address Hume's concerns. If it is indeed the case that PD identity is more philosophically negative in that it cannot assert a positive premise as easily as it can deconstruct positive premises, it would seem unlikely that PD identity will be able to defend people from the growth of the modern state and its bad philosophy. On the other hand, as Hume's common life dissolves due to the modern state, so it becomes increasingly likely that common life not only loses the capacity to stop the modern state, but also perverts into the banality of evil. As the collapse occurs, the collapse seems poised to increase momentum. Globalization seems to efface the possibility of a distinction between common life and PD identity, between the skeptic and the deconstructionist. If it is the case that PD identity is ultimately strong enough to fill the void left by waning common life, does this mean there's little hope for us unless we stop neoliberalism, and this is if PD identity isn't ultimately strong enough to fill the void? Perhaps, but at the same time, I find it very difficult to argue with Dietrich McCloskey about the extraordinary prosperity that capitalism has enabled the everyday person to enjoy. This problem is taken up in The Tragedy of Us by O.G. Rose, and perhaps McCloskey herself frowns upon the form of capitalism we see spreading around the world today, but that will have to be discussed at another time. Section 16. True philosophy is an achievement of self-inquiry, and so each generation must rediscover the truth of the dialectic for itself. Ideas are not experiences, and thus history, though dressed in different technological clothing, is always likely to repeat, for it is always unlikely that ideas have the same power to motivate action as do experiences. Though a new generation may read Livingston and Hume, and the importance of common life strike the new generation as critical and mentally important, it will be very difficult for the experiences of that generation, experiences of better technology, larger city-states, greater pluralism, not to win out and convince the new generation that autonomous rationality is actually and finally possible. Every generation, it feels like humanity really is ready to abandon restrictive givens and embrace metaphysical assumptions about reality that are far more global and optimistic about what we can socially engineer. George Steiner once wrote that if the gamble on transcendence no longer seems worth the odds and we are moving into a utopia of the immediate, the value structure of our civilization will alter after at least 3 millennia in ways almost unforeseeable. Just because how the alterations occur are unforeseeable would not make Hume outright against them. But if these alterations were a result of leaving behind culture, tradition, and natural belief instead of dramatic changes in common people, Hume would be deeply wary of them. But then again, perhaps Hume was wrong. Perhaps we really do live in a new world capable of grounding the lives of people in delusion and creativity never before seen in ages past. Then again, perhaps not. Perhaps philosophical hubris tricks us again. Is it possible for the internet to be a new ground for common life? Radically diverse, dynamic, absorbent, and progressive. If it was possible for the internet to be a source of community, wouldn't it be a PD ideal? Furthermore, as discussed in Homo Deus by Harari, could advances in biotechnology provide us with relief from the existential anxieties that bad philosophy causes, thus making bad philosophy no longer a pressing problem and removing the need for a return to common life? It's hard to say. The process of convincing a diverse people to become a nation is a miracle that occurs in every successful nation on earth. Nations decline or divide when they stop performing this miracle. Jonathan Haidt is correct with this reference, which leaves us having to decide Hume or Derrida is best for performing the miraculous task, or if our hope lies in stopping neoliberalism or learning to use the internet or biotech as a new foundation. It's mysterious how the miracle of social unity happens ultimately, but it's not mysterious what fate awaits us if it doesn't occur: anarchy, social upheaval, and totalitarianism. Is it human nature to be tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote, to use the words of Herman Melville, to be attracted by whole hope, to use language from O.G. Rose, to resent common life, to no longer to long for new places? What we don't experience, it would seem so, what we don't experience is that which we can form idealistic ideas about, and so ideas always have an advantage over experiences. Over experience, bad philosophy easily forms, and yet ideas are partly what make humans unique and able to cultivate nature into something civilized. Hume didn't disagree that ideas mattered, but if ideas are taken too far and become sources of resentment against the actual, we are in grave danger. Rationality without first principles is impossible, but in our resentment against common life, we can come to deceive ourselves into thinking our rationality is rational all the way down. This does not mean we should abandon philosophy, for philosophy is necessary, but rather we must learn to exercise philosophy within and respecting tradition. But what does it mean to do this while simultaneously using philosophy to increase justice and prepare for the future? What is the balance between Hume and Derrida? It would seem to be the PD who reveres and defends common life, so hopefully this is not impossible. If PD is right, no philosophical system can survive the fires of deconstruction, similar to how all systems, after a Humean critique, cannot earn the final judgment that they are the right system, even if there does exist a system that is actually more true than all the others. But while deconstruction suspends assenting to a system by deconstructing the system on arguably unfair and idealistic grounds, Hume suspends judgment to a system by acknowledging all systems are equally likely to be true. Deconstruction tears down systems to be left standing outside of all of them, while Hume stands outside systems while leaving them standing. However, though not all, the PD is right that perhaps some systems should be deconstructed because those systems increase injustice. Perhaps awareness of this possibility and the willingness to sometimes deconstruct is the lesson the Humean skeptic could take from the deconstructionist, while the deconstructionist needs to learn from the Humean skeptic that the impossibility of autonomous rationality doesn't invalidate all systems. Perhaps this is the middle ground that everyone should meet on to share a common life. This has been Deconstructing Common Life by O.G. Rose, featured in The Conflict of Mind. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.